And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive.
Welcome to Better to Speak, the podcast, where we use storytelling to transform silence into language and action. I'm your host, Kési Felton. In March of this year, Netflix released a 4-part limited series about the life of Madam C.J. Walker, the first self-made millionaire. It received a lot of attention as viewers curated their watch list at the onset of COVID-mandated quarantines, with most of the praise facing its star, Octavia Spencer, who received an Emmy nomination for her portrayal of the washerwoman turned beauty and hair care pioneer. Reviews celebrated the introduction of Madam Walker, born Sarah Breedlove, to a wider audience, but some specifically called out its dramatized rivalry between Walker and the series' antagonist, Addie Monroe, played by Carmen Ejogo. Monroe was inspired by Walker's real-life mentor and fellow businesswoman, Annie Turnbull Malone. The series itself was inspired by Madam C.J. Walker's biography, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, written by Walker's own great-great-granddaughter, Alelia Bundles. Now, when I watched the series, I felt a similar frustration with the dynamic between Walker and Monroe. One thing that I remember bothering me a lot from jump was the boxing scenes, which, in my personal humble opinion, I thought were corny, and took away from an opportunity to tell a moving and inspiring story about Madam Walker's rise to success. The storyline of their rivalry also focused extremely heavily on colorism. While that and the dynamic between upper-class black women and working-class black women were accurate for the time, many historians have come out to say that the two women were not only similar in complexion, but that their real-life relationship wasn't as dramatic as the series portrayed. As we see a rise in black storytelling and black representation in media, I personally think that the case of Self-Made showed me that just because a black person is telling the story, that doesn't mean they'll get it 100% right. With that, though, comes the fear of making your critiques known, which I believe comes from a scarcity mentality, which often leads us to believe that we have to put our 100% collective support behind any type of movie, black-owned business, product, whatever it is, that's created for and by black people, and that somehow means that thing is absolved of good faith critiques. I felt the same way about Harriet, where it was like, okay, we have this movie about this well-known historical figure in the black community, but when I saw the feedback on Twitter, it was like, I'm not really sure if I want to put money behind this to support this if it's not really going to uplift our community in the ways that we need, which I later realized was my internalization of cancel culture, but that's neither here nor there. But then I also felt like, well, we've never seen our stories being told in theaters like this before, so I do want to support it regardless of if it's perfect or not, so there isn't the case of, oh, it didn't perform well at the box office, so studios are going to use that to justify not backing our stories anymore. When I was able to see Harriet for myself, I realized a lot of what people were talking about didn't warrant anything or anyone being canceled, but I found the historical inaccuracies to be more irresponsible than anything. If certain dramatized parts of the storyline were historically accurate, that would be one thing, but it showed that the writers were more interested in drama and making it Hollywood than telling black stories, which we've been largely deprived of, and telling them accurately. Ms. Bundles actually, to my surprise, felt the same way about Self-Made, which she's expressed in a couple interviews that have come out since Self-Made has been released, but namely in an op-ed for The Undefeated, where she went in depth about the process to make the series and how she was essentially iced out from the production process once she raised concerns about the historical accuracy of the script. When I read her op-ed, I felt relieved because, again, I feel like sometimes black folks collectively stop at simply having a seat at the table, as simply being in the room, being represented, and think that raising any type of criticism after the fact towards our own people is somehow preventing us from moving forward and being successful. As a young storyteller, this op-ed showed me the importance of treating our stories and history with care as we're working to tell them, especially since that hasn't been the case throughout history, as well as the importance of speaking up when our stories are not treated with care. So I actually replied to her tweet when she posted about it, and her response pretty much sums up how I feel. If our stories were already well known, embellishment might work. There's an element of self-indulgence that takes hold if a writer doesn't really grasp the consequences of veering too far from the facts. If you're familiar with Better to Speak's origins, you know that black representation is incredibly meaningful to this brand and to me as an individual. I'm super honored to introduce our final interview for the season and to dedicate this episode to Chadwick Boseman, who perfectly illustrated through his life and career the importance of taking care of black stories and telling them with grace, purpose, and intention. I hope y'all have enjoyed this season of Better to Speak the podcast. As usual, additional resources will be in the show notes, as well as the link to sponsor this podcast and support Better to Speak in our off season.
My name is Alelia Bundles, and I am a journalist who spent 30 years working in network television news with NBC News and ABC News as a producer and later an executive. I also am Madam C.J. Walker's biographer and great-great-granddaughter, and I have written 4 books about her, and I'm almost finished with my 5th book, which is the first really comprehensive biography of her daughter, Alelia Walker, who was a central figure of the Harlem Renaissance.
Great. And one thing that I found really interesting was your background in news media. So can you talk about how has that background in news media influenced your perspective on Black representation in entertainment media, or maybe vice versa?
Sure. So when because I'm 68 years old, so that means I've been around a long time. But when I was in junior high school and high school in the 1960s, I was one of those kids who loved to write. I had my first story published when I was 8 years old, and I realized somehow at that moment the power of the pen. And I also loved doing it. So that then evolved into me working for the school newspaper in junior high school, working for the newspaper in high school. And when I went to college, I worked at the radio station. And then got a job in public affairs for a little while. I worked at a Black radio station in Indianapolis right after I graduated for the summer in news, and then went to Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and ended up working at NBC first and then ABC. So at that point, those were the doors that were open. The women had sued NBC News and Newsweek, and women who were hired as researchers and secretaries stayed in those roles, while young men who were hired in entry-level positions as production assistants and associate producers would advance to become the executive producers of shows. So women sued the media organizations, and I was one person who was very lucky to be a part of those doors opening, also with affirmative action. So I was one of the first women producers at NBC News. And it was really at a moment that was the media landscape was so entirely different. At that point, there were 3 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and then there was PBS and an occasional independent television station. So it's hard to even believe how different it is now with hundreds of cable channels and internet. But at that point, everybody was watching those 3 networks, and you knew that what was being presented made a difference. The television networks really had been quite instrumental in exposing Americans and the world to what was going on during the Civil Rights Movement. So those pictures of hoses that we see in Birmingham, the March on Washington, those things had a great deal of impact on what happened with civil rights. And I wanted to be a part of the message that made change. Now, at the same time, there were very few Black people and women in decision-making roles. So I experienced that while I was fortunate to have leadership roles and to try to make my voice heard. Often it was overridden by really unenlightened attitudes, not sometimes intentional, not always intentional, just not fully aware.
What led you to writing the first book? Like, what was that process, arriving to making the decision to write that book?
When I was growing up, my mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, and my dad was president of another hair care company called Summit Labs. But I didn't have any interest in going into would have been the family business or working in hair care. My interest was really in becoming a journalist. But when I was at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism in the fall of 1975, my advisor for my master's paper was a sister named Phyllis Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty. She had been a writer for Jet and Ebony. Her mother had been an editor at a Black newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier. And Phil was listening to my suggestions for my topics for my master's paper, and I think they were really lame and boring, and she knew that. And at the end of our conversation, she said, your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and her daughter, Alelia Walker? And I said, yes, that's my family. And Phil said to me, that's what you're going to write about. So I am forever grateful to her. If I'd had anybody else on that faculty, they would have just thought my name with that apostrophe and that two uppercase letters was just a weird thing. But Phil validated it for me. And that really set me on the course of understanding that I had this important story to tell. So I worked in network television for 30 years, but on the side, I was continuing to write, and I wrote my young adult book, which was my first biography of Madam Walker in 1991. And then that led to the 3 other books, including On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, which is really the definitive biography of Madam Walker.
Can you talk a little bit about the process behind, writing these books, like like researching, of course, that's your family, but like researching, going through your archives to get the information and then, tell it in a captivating way?
So, writing a book is, especially a book that requires a lot of historical research, can take a really long time and a lot of discipline and a lot of patience. And my family, we did not sit around the dinner table talking about Madam Walker. So it was not, and I'm glad that we didn't. My mother didn't want that to be, my entire identity, so that I was able to do the things that were important to me and to follow my own dreams. But it really was my grandfather who was the person who had saved a lot of things that had belonged to his wife, my grandmother, and to Alelia Walker and Madam Walker. Their photographs, scrapbooks, books signed by Count Cullen and Langston Hughes, their clothes, their jewelry, all of those things were in his apartment in Indianapolis, and later after he moved back to his family home in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And he was a great storyteller. So I learned a lot of things from him. And my mother, as vice president of the Walker Company, I would go to her office, and I knew that there was this beautiful but aging Flatiron building in the Black neighborhood in Indianapolis. But ultimately, inside that building, we discovered years later were tens of thousands of pages of business records, personal letters, photographs, advertisements, and those things now have been, we gave them to the Indiana Historical Society. They've now been digitized and are online. So I had a great trove of material, which is really quite rare for a Black-owned company and a woman-owned company from the early 20th century. But then you can have that material and it just sits there and you're not doing anything with it. One really key moment for me is that in the early 1980s, Alex Haley, the author of Roots, came to us and asked about doing a book, essentially a fictionalized biography of Madam Walker and a miniseries. And he was still riding the wave of the fame and success of Roots, the miniseries and the book. And I became the researcher for that project. Alex never finished the book. He died in 1992, but during that decade when I knew him, he became a mentor and he gave me great guidance on how to organize your material. And one key thing he said to me in the beginning was, make a folder for every year of the person's life, a manila folder. Buy yourself some milk crates, buy yourself some hanging folders, and create a filing system. And that has been amazing for me because, literally 40 years later, I now have 2 rooms of research. But I wouldn't have had that in that way without him advising me. So I have folders that have the years, and I've dropped in them for literally decades at this point. I have, more than 500 names of people who were their friends and their associates and family members, organizations. Like there's a file on the NAACP, there's a file on the East St. Louis riot of 1917, there's a file on Madam Walker and suffrage. So I have all of those things organized. So now as I am writing this first really definitive biography on Alelia Walker, all I have to do is think, okay, what is that? And I go to the file, because otherwise there would be absolutely no way to access that information if you just had to go through piles and piles of stuff you can't remember.
Right. And I ask about the process of gathering that information, because I don't think people realize, like, especially thinking about Self-Made, the limited series on Netflix, like the process that goes behind, these historical, whether it's a drama, like these historical pieces of content. So can you talk a little bit about how the opportunity for Self-Made and like what your role involvement was with that?
Sure. So Self-Made, the Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer, is, as Hollywood says, inspired by my book, which is a contrivance that allows Hollywood to use a great deal of creative license and not stick to the facts. So that's the truth on that. Octavia Spencer, I thought, was great. She was the perfect person for the role. And I think every time she came on the screen, I felt that she was embodying the dignity and struggle and challenge and triumph of Madam Walker. So I was happy about that. And I'm glad that more people now know Madam Walker's name. But the thing that happens with a Hollywood movie, at least in the hands of some writers, is that a great deal can be changed if people don't really respect the history. There are, when we think about the loss of Chadwick Boseman and the characters he played Thurgood Marshall, James Brown, Jackie Robinson, and those are real life characters. And I think he brought a dignity to those characters. And there was a sense of, there's always criticism of a Hollywood film, but I think that he made you feel the dignity of those people. And I think that it's, stayed close to the truth. In the case of Self-Made, that really became a challenge for me. When my book was optioned by a production company, I agreed. I had had many other offers, and I agreed to go with this particular production company because the producer seemed to really respect my work, seemed to value all of those years of research and all of that documentation that I had done, and understood we seemed to be on the same page. Unfortunately for me, once a writer was hired and the studio was involved, the writer had presented her concept, her vision of the series to me in a phone conversation. And she said that she wanted to focus on the conflict between Madam Walker and her competitor, Annie Malone. And I very casually said, well, I think that's an element, but I wouldn't make that the centerpiece of the story. And when it became clear, I guess, in that casual way that I did not agree with her vision, she intentionally made sure that I was excluded from the conversations. So I was supposed to have been part of the meetings with the studios, the pitch meetings. I was supposed to have been involved, but every time I asked for 2 years, there was always an excuse to not have me included. So, but I did have in my contract with Warner Brothers a clause that said I had script review. And that meant that they were supposed to show me the scripts before they started shooting. And so we had to kind of press for that, even though it should have been forthcoming. Ultimately, I was able to see the scripts, and I was stunned because the things that I had asked them not to do, they did. They not only made Madam Walker and her real life rival the centerpiece of the story, but then they distorted that relationship. And Annie Malone in real life, who became Addie Monroe in the series, was a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. In the series, she became a person who was not as successful, who became a really petty person. They contrived a conflict based on colorism, which did not happen in real life. And there were many other parts of the series that after I looked at the script, after I reviewed the script and gave my notes, that I asked them not to do, that they did anyway, including there was the Bill Bellamy character named Sweetness was a pimp and a numbers runner. He didn't exist. He was not the cousin of F.B. Ransom, Madam Walker's attorney. And it particularly bothered me because in real life, Mr. Ransom was a very strong male character who they could have made into a strong male character, who had taken an oath as a young man to never drink, smoke, or gamble. So he was a straight arrow, and to portray him as somebody who bet on the numbers and then therefore used illegally gained money to invest in the Walker Company, for me, presented a stereotype of both that Black people have to be criminals, that there's a pimp and there's a numbers runner, and that a Black business has to have investment from illegal gain. That was not true. The character of Booker T. Washington, Madam Walker had a complicated relationship with Booker T. Washington, and this is where I think for a really talented writer, they would have been able to convey that. But I think that there was such a reliance on formulaic ways of approaching, on tropes and stereotypes, and just using the same old in Hollywood, that they made him into, just a despicable misogynist, when in reality, Madam Walker and Booker T. Washington did get off to a rocky start. They had some differences of views, but ultimately that relationship evolved to one of respect. Still some contention, but for me, that's more complicated. And then the final thing I will say, because there are many things that I didn't like, though I will say I liked Octavia. I love the wigs. I like the fact that we got to see some prosperous Black people in the early 20th century in America, which most of America doesn't know, including Black America doesn't know was a reality. But the last little point that I would make is that the character of Esther, who was portrayed as the girlfriend of A'Lelia Walker, was not a real character. And there was a little bit, I thought, of some deception with me, where I was asked at one point, before I'd seen any scripts and before I'd really had any conversations, and I'm assuming that there's going to be good faith in this. They asked, what do you think about exploring A'Lelia Walker's sexuality? And I said, well, I don't know. Tell me what you're thinking. So they first came back to me with because they seemed to really want to develop an LGBT relationship, which would have been fine with me if it had happened. And A'Lelia Walker had many queer friends, but this didn't happen. But they first came back to me with this, oh, well, we'll have a menage a trois. And I said, well, that doesn't really fit what I know her to be. That, that's not like that didn't happen, but that didn't really seem plausible for her. Then they came back with a character who was a famous woman jazz singer who was bisexual, and they just sort of clopped her in to make her girlfriend. And I said, but I met this person in the 1980s, and she told me they didn't like each other. So that's really not the right way to go. So then they made up this character, Esther. And I think they were trying to create conflict, which you have to do in a Hollywood movie. They were trying to create some point of conflict between mother and daughter. But for me, and what I'm writing about in my new book, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, there was a really dramatic real life conflict between mother and daughter, but it was over two men. A'Lelia Walker had two boyfriends. Both were doctors. Both were handsome. One was a bad boy. One was kind of a good guy. And who did Madam Walker like better? Of course, the good guy. She wanted the good guy for her daughter. Who did her daughter like better? The bad boy with the swagger. So that was real life conflict. Now, ultimately, she married first one and then the other. But for me, that would have been a much more interesting storyline, and it was true.
The one thing that was really interesting to me, like I remember you write about this in your op-ed for The Undefeated, how, people would ask you, like, what did you think about it, like when it first came out, and how you intentionally waited until like a few months because you didn't want to jeopardize, the release of it. So can you talk about that decision and the intention behind waiting and even in saying anything at all, because you really could have just, sat by and let it be what it was?
Right. The thing that I have learned in this process is that getting anything made in Hollywood is really difficult, no matter who you are. And getting something done where there is a predominantly Black cast and a Black lead is also really challenging, because the conventional wisdom in Hollywood is, well, first, we're putting up a lot of money and we need to make the money back, and we need to make as much money as we can. So the quality can be whatever it is as long as we make a lot of money. But in this case, the conventional wisdom is Black things don't sell overseas, that it's a limited audience. But that trope really has been challenged, and it partially with April Reign's hashtag Oscars So White, and then the success of 12 Years a Slave and The Butler and Moonlight and Selma and what Ava DuVernay is doing. I mean, we can see that there are really commercially successful films that have Black cast. And in this case, this was a role of a lifetime. There are dozens of actresses who have wanted to do Madam Walker and people who wanted to tell the story. So I knew this was a golden opportunity, but I saw it being squandered. And at the same time, there were so many people who were excited about this, who wanted to work on it, whether it was the makeup people, the hair people, the behind the scenes people. In this case, to have 2 Black women directors, Casey Lemons and Demaine Davis, to have a Black woman who was the director of photography, to have 2 Black women showrunners, a Black woman head writer. Those were, to be able to know that all of those people were working, Black actors, just the whole range of people who felt so deeply about Madam Walker and who wanted to be a part of this. I did not want to skew the response to that. I had watched what had happened with other films, and I didn't really want to destroy that moment for all of those people who had worked so hard. And so I just I waited. I mean, I'm old enough that I know that you will ultimately get the opportunity to say what you want to say and to say what needs to be said. And I knew that the issues that I was raising during the scripting process with the head writer and the showrunners and one of the producers, the things that I told them were problematic because I've been living with this story all my life and I know what people want to see. They dismissed those things. And those were the very things that the critics and Black Twitter and Black YouTube had objections to. But I needed for other people to say those things so that I wasn't just, being the critical person.
Your comments about everything definitely resonated with me as a writer, like as a young writer, and kind of aspiring to, maybe one day work on a show, maybe one day write a book, like all these different things. It resonated with me in the fact that it's like, as a Black storyteller specifically, like you have to have a lot of care and intention when telling our stories. And you mentioned when you replied to me on Twitter, like it's almost the self-indulgence when you like you said, kind of ignore the things that you raised about self-made. And so can you talk a little bit about how Black storytellers need to or should navigate that? Because you don't want to miss out on very scarce opportunities for Black storytellers, but at the same time, like you said, like not everybody knows the facts about Madam C.J. Walker. Not everyone knows the facts about our history. So how do you navigate between those? Like, how do I, express my vision versus what needs to be shared?
Yeah, it is very tricky. I certainly experienced this when I was a young producer and even, an experienced producer at NBC and ABC, that there are people who are your boss, or somebody else who's making a decision and who has the ability to say, well, no, that's not the way we're going to do it. I had one of those examples when I was a producer at World News Tonight at ABC, and it was during the O.J. Simpson trial. And I was in DC, I was doing kind of feature pieces for World News Tonight, albeit 3 to 4 minutes. Those were long pieces, not like, but at that moment, it's hard for me to believe this, I was the only Black producer on the World News Tonight staff. And the show wanted to do something on this so-called Black card, playing the Black card on, because that was much of the conversation among white media and white critics about the trial. And so they made me go to LA as the Black producer. I didn't want to go, but it's my job. And so they assigned me to it. I take the assignment. So I go to LA, and I think, if you're sending the Black girl to go to LA, then you're sending me because somehow maybe you think I'm going to find something that my white colleagues are not going to find, because otherwise, why send a Black body? If you just want a Black body, okay, but I'm going to try to give a perspective that I think nobody else on your staff will give. So I go to LA, I interview I make sure, I'm the producer, but so I'm working with the correspondent and the camera crew. And I set up an interview with the editor of the Black newspaper, the LA Sentinel. I set up an interview with the head of the Urban League in LA. We interview some people, the people on the street, what do people think? And we put together those interviews. And when the reporter and I present the script, the senior producer on the show has questions about the perspectives from the Black newspaper editor and the Urban League leader. And those are the things that get left out of the script. So I'm like, why did you send me? I'm trying to tell you what people are thinking. I'm not making a judgment whether what they're thinking is accurate or not accurate. I'm telling you their position. So that when the verdict came, you've probably seen those pictures of the Black people cheering that O.J. Simpson is not found guilty. And white media is all shocked. Well, I tried to tell, in that story, to try to say, let's present this position because people are defending him. Now, I personally thought O.J. Simpson was guilty. But it wasn't my job. My job was to try to present a perspective that would not ordinarily have been there. So I tell you that long version of that story to say that there are times when you are working as part of a team where you don't always get your way. You can't always say the things that you want to say, or your position may not win that particular argument. But I think you just continue to try to stay in your truth. And sometimes, I was able to get that experience in the mainstream, large media organization. And I learned my storytelling skills that are really great and helpful to me. But other people make different decisions. My good friend, Stanley Nelson, who is the grandson of Madam Walker's attorney, F.B. Ransom, who is the very well-known documentary producer, whose first documentary was $2 and a Dream about Madam Walker. Stanley made a decision to not work in those mainstream, those sort of corporate entities, and to become an independent producer and to focus on telling stories about Black people that give the perspective of Black people. So sometimes you have to make some decisions, make some pivots, and go in a different direction in order to stay true to your own perspective. But you see the different levels, you see different filmmakers and what they're doing. How Ava DuVernay has been able to walk in her truth, but she had with Selma, she didn't get some of the credit that she deserved, but you just have to keep fighting and fighting. And then if you do get to be a writer on a show, you have to go with what the showrunner tells you. The studio is telling the showrunner and the director what to do because the studio is putting up the money. So there's always, there always are some challenges that you have to navigate and negotiate. And I think that a lot of times people if you have 5 battles that you are fighting, you might win 3, but you lose 2. And that's kind of the way it works. But I am wondering now, if at this moment of reckoning that we're seeing, where Hollywood studios and law firms and corporations and internet companies and social media companies are being pressured to take another look at some of these decisions that they made or some of these assumptions that they made, if this might not be an opening for a little bit of change. And if there's anything that I hope comes out of my experience, so I was fortunate that my book was turned into a series. It wasn't exactly what I had envisioned, but it still was a successful series, and it has given me a bit of a platform. And one of the things that I really hope to do is to be able to empower others to speak up, because I think people are afraid to speak up if they don't like something. But, I don't work in Hollywood. So I'm not looking for my next gig. I'm not worried about, is somebody going to hire me? I'm worried about the truth. I'm worried about trying to make sure that we don't perpetuate stereotypes and that more films get made, because our stories are so interesting. They do not need to be placed into these formulas.
As Black consumers of content, I think it almost reminds me of politics in a way. Like, people kind of trust that the correct information will be given to them, and it's not always the case. Like you mentioned, that you hope for this to be an opportunity for people to learn more about Madam Walker and then be, interested in learning more and doing more research. But then you have to think about people who are just like, I just want to be entertained and watch and not really think about doing all this extra homework. So like, how do you, for example, create content that's, interesting enough that people will, do that extra research, like, reading your books after watching Self-Made, or, as a consumer, like understanding that, just creating a certain level of intention in your practice of consuming content and being like, I have to double check this information for myself, or kind of, do more research and learn more.
Yeah, well, you're right. Most people just want to be entertained. That's why Real Housewives of Atlanta is so popular.
Right.
So I think you just have to know that is the case, that's really where most people are coming from, and to find that audience that you really that really resonates with you. I just think of something like Moonlight. That was a small film that had such a huge impact. He was so true to, Barry Jenkins was so true to the story that he wanted to tell. And I think if you just have to walk in your truth, and everybody is not going to love what you do. That's why there are all kinds of genres, but find the message that you really want to give. And as they say, if you build it, they will come.
That's it for this episode. You can find us on social media at bettertospeak_ or on our website, bettertospeak.org. If you want to sponsor an episode and support Better to Speak, you can find the link to donate in the description of whatever podcasting platform you're listening on. Be sure to tune in to future episodes where we'll dive into various socio-political topics with the goal of transforming silence into language and action. Once again, I'm your host, Kési Felton. Thank you for listening.